Hey y'all, this week we are talking about epidemics and pandemics and outbreaks of disease, mostly talking about sort of communicable infectious diseases. So up front, the last time I gave this lecture was before we had a global pandemic. I've never given this lecture during a global pandemic because we've never lived through one, much less one that has lasted for the past year and has fundamentally changed sort of our everyday lives. That's why I'm here on a video instead of in a classroom with you, and a lot of different sort of things. And so first, I just want you to kind of sit with that. Think about what has changed, right? If you were in this class a year ago, you would have been talking about a very hypothetical sort of thing. We would have been talking about infectious diseases. No, what happens if there were a worldwide outbreak, and who knows what would happen, right? But now we kind of know what happens, which is a lot of crazy stuff, right? So thinking about what you read, for this week, that is the stuff that I've always had my students read for this class, thinking about sort of some of the last pandemics, so bird flu, avian flu, those other sort of things. In the lecture, I'll talk a little bit about some other sort of epidemics and communicable diseases. But now we have this whole new world, and we've been able to think about some things in different ways. In the US, we know how we've been affected, right? And we think of ourselves, or at least we have the social sort of consciousness of like the US, we can do everything. We're one of the most rich and powerful nations in the world. And yet we've seen how the pandemic has absolutely crippled the United States. What do we think is happening sort of in countries where they have less everything, right? Less infrastructure, less knowledge, less medicine, all these other sort of things. If we're experiencing things in such a grave and serious way, what happens in other countries when they're experiencing different epidemics? How have we been isolated from those in the past? And how does this change everything moving forward? And so those are just sort of the questions that I like to start out with in terms of this week. So previous to this epidemic, one of the things that I liked to talk about was polio. Polio is one of the few infectious diseases that we've ever gotten a really good hang on in the past couple of decades. Smallpox would be a different one, and we've actually eradicated smallpox, the only disease we've ever eradicated, and we've eradicated it with vaccines. But that one I'm going to put aside because that one was a different sort of beast, and I'm going to talk about polio. So for the most part, polio was under control. We've wiped it out, kind of what they call wild polio, so things that are happening and the spread of polio, except for in about the past decade, polio has started to inch back, right? So polio used to be this thing that people got, way back in the day, and they'd end up in iron lungs and all these sort of things. And then, hey, boom, we invented the polio vaccine, and that's pretty much taking care of it. However, if we look at a couple of countries, specifically Pakistan, Nigeria, and Afghanistan, we've seen some huge resurgences of polio outbreaks. And then we've seen some smaller outbreaks of some of the related sort of childhood diseases, which I'll talk about in a minute. Specifically, when we look at sort of Pakistan, Nigeria, and Afghanistan, the things that are the commonality in those three and polio has been the rise of vaccine resistance. And so we have a polio vaccine. It's been around forever. Everybody in the United States gets it typically as children. And so what happened in these three countries? Well, in these three countries, in Pakistan and Afghanistan, we know that there was the Taliban and some of these religious fundamentalist sort of groups that didn't want Western science and Western medicine to be influencing people. And so they said, resist these vaccines. It's just the West trying to put us under their control, trying to experiment on us and do all these other sort of things. Now, Nigeria is a different sort of case, but similar. Nigeria is a multi-ethnic country. They've had some multi-ethnic and religious violence. The northern part of Nigeria is heavily fundamentalist Muslim, and the southern part of Nigeria is much more Christian, based across a couple of different ethnic groups. And so in Nigeria, the polio surge was actually happening in the north, where they had sort of the fundamentalist Muslim groups there, and they were connected a lot to Pakistan and Afghanistan and those sort of things. And so we saw huge spikes in polio, particularly in these very fundamentalist sort of communities, as religious leaders and imams said, don't take that medicine, it's Western medicine, they're trying to kill us, and do these other sort of things. Saw huge rates of polio rise, giant amounts of death, all these sort of things. And then they kind of backed off that and said like, oh, maybe we should go back to doing those sort of things. And so since that sort of resurgence, we've seen some good progress there. Now, the next slide that I have is looking at, so Boko Haram is the fundamentalist Muslims in northern Nigeria. Then I have a picture of the Taliban, and I have a picture of Jenny McCarthy. What do all of these people have in common? Well, all of them have in common are they're all anti-vaxxers, right? So Jenny McCarthy very famously went on a crusade against the MMR, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, saying that it caused her son's autism. We know that that is a bunk correlation. We know that the person who found a link between autism and the MMR made it up completely. He's lost his license, all that sort of stuff. But these anti-science attitudes persist. So some of them come from these religious sort of reasons, right? That's where we see Boko Haram and Taliban and some of these fundamentalist Muslim sort of beliefs. But we also see in Western medicine a lot of anti-science sort of religious beliefs. So whether it be Christian fundamentalist, some of the sort of fundamentalist FLDS sects, or some of these other sort of things, they believe like, nope, God will protect us, and so we don't need vaccines, and so we don't take vaccines. Okay. We are also starting to see a rise in non-fundamentalist sort of religions, but much more in terms of the evangelical Christians who are now debating all sorts of things. So not just sort of vaccines, but this evolution and creationism, climate change, all that sort of stuff, and what have you. We're also seeing a lot of rise of anti-government, pro-natural, anti-pharma sort of movements, which on a sort of side token, yes, pharmaceutical companies have a lot of bad stuff going on in them, right? Pharmaceutical companies also save our lives every sort of day. And so one of the things that gets lost in these bigger debates is that, yes, it is worthy and valuable to critique pharmaceutical companies for their crazy amounts of money that they make and a lot of this weird sort of patenting and other sort of stuff around medicine. However, pharmaceutical companies also save our lives every day. And the science that happens at pharmaceutical companies is being done by scientists. The crappy capitalism and other sort of stuff is being done by business people at the top of these pharmaceutical companies. And so it's a really important sort of thing to recognize that there's a lot of nuance. However, in the US and in other places, we lose a lot of that nuance. And so people are just like, vaccines are bad, they're from big pharma, don't do those things. And then they come up with other sort of weird ideas. And so we've seen a huge resurgence of epidemics across the US, and we're seeing them around the world. And so all of this sort of stuff was already percolating prior to this COVID pandemic coming out, right? You've heard about sort of the outbreaks of pertussis or whooping cough happening at Disneyland and other sort of things because of the rise in anti-vaxxer sort of families. And so this is an issue that we're having to grapple with all of the time. This is, something that I talk a lot about in this course when we talked about human rights. Does science have all the answers? Well, even if science does have all the answers, which I don't believe, science doesn't have all the answers. They have a lot of answers, but not all of them. If we don't even believe scientists, well, then what does it matter if they have the answers, right? If we can't get people to believe in science and believe what scientists are saying, or if we can't have a nuanced discussion of how business and medicine and pharmaceuticals all work together in a way that we can critique sort of capitalist fundamental sort of basics of pharmaceuticals, but also still retain the fact that science and pharmaceutical agents can be good and life-saving, then we get to this sort of problem. We're now dealing with this idea of herd immunity, right? Herd immunity is there for people who cannot take certain sort of things because there are conditions that don't happen. What we're seeing right now is a lot of debate around COVID of what is herd immunity? How can we get to that? When can we return to sort of quote unquote normal life? Well, we're seeing that political answer kind of shifts around. In general, we typically think of herd immunity needs to be in the 80 and 90 percentile, so that most people are vaccinated, and that the last sort of 10 to maybe 20% of people who aren't vaccinated are the people who truly can't, people who have immunocompromised sort of states, people who are not old enough to get vaccinated, these sort of things. And now we're having this sort of public debate of how does this go back into our sort of regular life. Now we're saying like, well, maybe it should be 6 60% or maybe 70%. I still firmly believe, and the reason that you're seeing me behind this sort of screen is that we need to get to at least 80% to get some herd immunity. And even that is just our sort of low best number. And so there's a lot of this sort of thing of where politics and science and all these things are meeting in the middle that causes a big ripple effect sort of in our lives. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that we need to think about in terms of how do we have a basic sort of moral guidance for how do we keep the public's health safe, right? Because that's what we are. We're public health people. We want everybody to be safe and healthy and have the best life possible. And yet we also want to value human rights and dignity and all these other sort of things. And so a lot of places, these two things sort of come together. Now, another place where this becomes interesting is when we think about epidemics that we no longer even think of as epidemics, right? The HIV epidemic is something that was huge news in the 80s and 90s. And now HIV is still big, but we don't really think of it as an epidemic, right? It's not something that we're worried about. Back in the 80s, they sure did, right? They wouldn't let kids go to school if they had HIV. They had all sorts of weird, crazy rules that you couldn't do all sorts of things because we didn't know about HIV, right? Now we know, and we know it's not easily passed. It has to be a pretty specific sort of mode of transmission. And so now HIV is treated much more like a chronic disease, even though it is still an infectious agent. It is something that you get as a transferable, transmittable sort of disease. It's not so contagious now that we know that it's not a simple sort of passing along like breath or spit or any other sort of thing. And when people get HIV now, they don't necessarily die. They can live very, very long, healthy lives with the advances in pharmaceuticals, because we know that pharmaceuticals can do a lot of good sort of stuff. And so in those sort of cases, how do we treat those in different sort of ways, right? One thing that we can look at is the Ebola epidemic, right? Ebola has been something that kind of came into our consciousness in the last decade. But did you know that Ebola has been around actually probably for maybe close to 100 years? What? How did we know that? Well, number one, we don't really look at old cases of Ebola. Number two, we have sort of limits on historical data and geographical stuff as globalization has happened. Most of the Ebola outbreaks throughout history have happened in Africa, in distant sort of villages and places, right? As we've talked about before, pretty much if it happens over there, we don't really care, right? When did we start to care about Ebola? Well, we started to care about Ebola in 2014 when it came to the Western countries, right? We had a huge epidemic in the West African sort of areas, and all of a sudden everybody was worried about Ebola, right? We had WHO going there, we had all this sort of stuff, and because of globalization now, people could get on a plane and be infected with Ebola, and then arrive in the United States and infect other sort of people. And so we had a huge response to that, right? But Ebola was also really super heavy duty, kills really fast, has a really high mortality rate. And so we have to look at some of those sort of things. And so now thinking about, well, when we saw Ebola, we were able to go into like super huge mode and send all this money and time and resources and other sort of things to West Africa to try and control the epidemic. And then the main reason that we did so was to try and keep Ebola out of the United States, right? We ended up having 7 different Americans infected with it, and they closed down an entire hospital wing for them to try and save their lives, which they all did, and contain the spread, because if that had gotten through the US, yikes, right? And so now here we are in another epidemic, a pandemic of COVID, right? And unfortunately, we were not able to contain this one. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of reasons. It has to do with sort of political reasons at the time. It has to do with geographic sort of locations and globalization and travel. It also has to do with a lot of lack of science attitudes and a lot of fundamental sort of racism, right? We thought like, oh, it's those Asian people who are getting it, and let's just say no Asians in the United States, even though we have our own Asian Americans here in the United States. And because of the political sort of will and, oh, we don't believe in science and this sort of stuff, I don't need to wear a mask, we don't need to quarantine, blah, blah, blah. Year later, here we are, still high rates of COVID, still high rates of anti-Asian violence, all sorts of things, just kind of combating all around us. And so we can see now that diseases and public health and epidemic sort of stuff has the ability to shape sort of the whole course of a world, right? And so in the United States, we've shut down the economy, we've shut down sort of normal life, we have all this different sort of stuff, all because we didn't take public health seriously, right? How are we going to do that in a different sort of way in the future? Well, will we learn from this? I wish we would. But as of right now, it doesn't even still look like we're learning all that much. There's still people who are saying, no, I don't want to get the COVID vaccine. No, I'm not going to wear masks. All these sort of things, even though demonstratably we know COVID has fundamentally changed our world. And so there's a lot of ways that we just need to figure out how do we better get the public on board with these sort of things. And it's not an easy fix, right? If it was an easy fix, we could have fixed this a long time ago, except it's not, right? How do we combat these anti-science attitudes? How do we make sure that we're spreading good knowledge and science-based knowledge without being neo-colonialists? Or how do we make sure that we're not being cultural imperialists and saying like, oh, you shouldn't do these sort of things? What if we had actually closed all borders to Asia truly and not let anybody in, right? Well, that's probably fundamentally a big issue in terms of demographic spread and freedom of movement, but also there's some racial sort of undertones there. However, could that have saved us if we could have localized it and kept it much more safe? But we didn't, right? How much of it was that we didn't really know what was going on until it was way too late, right? And so there's so many questions that we do. And so I think this is just a really important sort of factor and time to think about what is it that we've learned from this pandemic? What is it that we've learned about how fragile sort of economies and peace and relationships and education and all these sort of things are in the face of this little teeny tiny germ, right? That's fundamentally what we have learned is that, COVID was this little tiny thing. It was a zoonosis that jumped from bats to humans. And now here we are a year later in the midst of the one of the greatest pandemics we've ever seen. I think that's a pretty heavy sort of thing. And for the basis of this class, what does that mean when we think about all these other issues? Lack of infrastructure, talking about women's rights, talking about how do we empower children, talking about wars, talking about all this sort of stuff, when boom, we've seen in the last year, a pandemic can just cripple all of that. So that is the basics of sort of this lecture. There are some resources, some other sort of links and other things that you can look at if you're interested in looking more at sort of epidemics and epidemiological data, tired today, and trying to think about these sort of things. It's a big field, clearly a growing field. Public health isn't going away. It's only going to get bigger and stronger. And so y'all are in the right field for a lot of good reasons. So that's it for this week. You're going to have a light sort of discussion this week because I want you to put most of your attention and focus on that policy paper draft. And I think that's all. All right, bye.